Let's look at how to deploy a Laravel application on a Ubuntu server running Apache. To do this, of course, you're going to need a Laravel application. Here's the example I'm working with. I've got it running locally. I just took a bare bones Laravel application, customized the homepage. I did add a single route within there just so we can test the routing system once we get things deployed. And the code base for this I have on a repository on github.com. This is how we're going to get it to the server. We're going to clone it from this repository. In terms of the server, it should of course be running Apache, and you should have SSH access to it. The way that I'm going to get access is I'm connecting via my code editor, VSCode. I'm using their SSH plugin. So right now this window is directly connected to my server. So anything I do here, whether it be via command line or the file browser, is going to be happening on the server itself. Alternatively, you could just connect to your server via regular SSH via command line, run the commands there. That would work as well. As part of the setup process, I'm also going to be showing how to configure a domain or subdomain to point to your Laravel application on your server. In order to do this, you do need to pre-configure the domain you want to use to point to the IP address of your server. And just to show what that looks like, switching over, this is NameCheap.com. This is where I have my domains registered. I'm within my DNS settings, and I went ahead and set up a subdomain for this demo. So I've got the subdomain of demo. This is going to be on this domain, codewithsusan.com, and it's pointing to the IP address of the server that I'm working with. I'm using a subdomain here just because I don't want to interfere with the content of my main domain, but you could set this up with a primary domain, a subdomain, however you want to set it up, just as long as that domain is pointing to the IP address of your server. Just to show that this is working, I'm going to go to demo.codewithsusan.com. And right now it's just showing the default splash page we get with DigitalOcean servers when setting up a Linux Apache-based server. So by the time we're done with this, this should be pointing to our Laravel application. The final prerequisite is your web server is going to need to be able to communicate with GitHub. So it needs to authenticate that communication, and I recommend setting this up with SSH keys. If this is something you have not already set up, I do have a separate guide that goes over the details of doing that. But if you have done it, or if you're not sure if you've done it, the way you can confirm it is while SSH'd into your server, run the command ssh-t git@github.com. And if it reports back hi, whatever your GitHub username is, you've successfully authenticated, you know you have your SSH keys set up. If not, like I said, go through this guide and you can get that set up. So with all those prerequisites behind us, let's jump in. The first thing we need to do is just make sure that our server is prepared to run a Laravel application. And for this, we're going to reference the Laravel docs on server requirements. And within these docs, we can see that as of this recording, the minimum requirement of PHP for Laravel is 8.1. And here's a list of PHP extensions we're going to need on our server. Now, if you're watching this video in the future, you might see different version numbers here. You might even see different PHP extensions. So whatever I'm about to say, just apply it to what you're currently seeing in the documentation. So digging into this, let's first check our PHP version. And the first check I'm going to do is just via command line. I'm going to invoke PHP with the version flag. And you can see it's reporting back 8.2. So I'm good to go with that 8.1 minimum requirement. But this is specific to just PHP from command line. I need to also make sure that the PHP module that Apache is using is the appropriate version. So for this, I'm going to create a info page that's going to output a bunch of information about my web server to the browser so we could double check that. Where I'm going to create this is in my main document root, which in this server, it's in var www.html. So I'm going to move into that directory. And within here, I will create a file, just call it info.php. And then within this file, in PHP, I'm just going to invoke the built-in PHP info function, and then pull this up in my browser. And it looks like we're good to go. Also running 8.2.6 here, meeting that 8.1 minimum requirement. Now, in your case, if you find that you need to upgrade PHP to work with Laravel, I do have a separate guide on that. You can find a link in the notes that accompanied this video. I'll also include a link in the video description. But assuming you're good with that, the next thing we want to check from the server requirements is we want to make sure we have all of these PHP extensions set up on our server. The way we're going to do that is we're going to invoke the command php-m to output all of our currently installed PHP extensions. So coming back to command line, I'm going to say php-m. And what we want to do with these list of extensions is basically cross-reference it with the list of extensions that Laravel lists in their docs. And just to save us some time, I did that before recording this video, and here are the results I found. I had most of the extensions. There were 3 I was missing: curl extension, DOM extension, MB string, and then XML. All right, so in my case, those are 4 extensions I need to add to my server. And the way that we can do that is using apt-get, a common dependency management program for Linux-based operating systems. The procedures are quite simple. The first thing we need to do is set up a repository where we're going to be getting our modules from. This is a very common one we use in the world of PHP. So I'm just going to copy this command and run it. Press enter when it prompts you to do so. With that complete, the next command we want to run is apt-get update to get the latest packages from our apt repositories. And now we can actually get our modules, and we're going to do that with this command apt-get install, and we're going to list all the modules that we need. So here in this example, you can see I've got that curl module, the DOM module, MB string, and XML. Those were the 4 that I was missing. For any of these module names, you just want to prefix it with the version of PHP that you're currently running on your server. And in this example, in addition to the 4 missing modules, I'm also going to be adding in the MySQL PHP module, just because that's the database type I typically use in my Laravel applications. If you're not using a database, it's not required, but just wanted to include this just to note that you might need to do some additional work to get your database up and running. I'm also throwing in the modules zip and unzip. These are 2 modules that Composer, our dependency management program we use in Laravel, is going to expect. If you don't include this, you'll get some warnings when you get to working with Composer here in a moment. So long story short, adapt this command as needed for the modules you're missing on your server, and then go ahead and run it. And then we can run that php-m command again, just to double check that we're good to go. So for example, there's that DOM module I was missing before. It's now listed there. There's MB string, and then XML, and then the 4th one was curl, so we could see that as well. So with all our modules in place, the next step is we need to make sure that our Apache server has URL rewriting enabled. This is going to be essential for Laravel's routing system to work. To do this, we can run this command to enable the rewrite module. And then we'll go grab another command to restart our Apache server to make those changes take effect. Next up, we want to make sure our server has Composer installed. To check to see if you have it installed, just try to invoke it. If it says command not found, you don't have it installed. And so coming back to the notes, you need to install it. First step to do that is move into your system's user bin directory. It's a common location to put command line based programs. So we'll do that first. Once we're in that directory, we're going to run this curl command to download the Composer installer. And at this point, Composer is installed, but it is installed with this .phar extension, which we don't want to have to type out every time we invoke Composer. So we're just going to rename that using the move command. So I can say composer.phar to simply just Composer. All right, and now to test it out, let's invoke Composer. And in my case, I am getting a warning about running Composer as the root user, because you can see I'm currently logged in as the root or admin user. And that's just because this is for demo purposes. I created the server to record this video. I'm going to be deleting it afterwards. I didn't create a separate user to interact with my application in Composer, which is what you should be doing. Because with Composer, you're dealing with outside software. You don't want to interact with it as that root admin user, just because that root admin user has full privileges over your server and you don't want anything bad to happen there. So long story short, for security purposes, don't do what I'm doing in terms of operating as the root user. In my case, like I said, this is just a demo, so I'm going to ignore this, just say yes and proceed with working with Composer. And you can see the results of just invoking Composer in general. You see some output about how to use Composer. And this is basically what we're looking for at this point, is just confirmation that it's actually installed. And seeing that it's installed, that's the last thing we need to do in terms of preparing the server to run a Laravel application. Our next step, if we follow along in the notes, is to actually get the application we want to deploy. We want to get the code base, and we're going to get that from GitHub. So coming over to my repository on GitHub for this application I'm working with, I want to find the SSH address for this repository. I'll find this under the green code button. Make sure that SSH is chosen and just copy this URL. And then on my server, I want to move to the location where I want to put this application. And for this, I'm going to go back to that var www directory. I'm not going to go into HTML. That's the default document root on the server. I'm going to be creating a separate document root for this application. So I'm just going to put it in var www. So I'm going to move into there. And then here, I'm going to say git clone and paste in that SSH address. And it should pull down that code base to this directory. To confirm that it works, if we look at our directory contents, we should now have a directory named after our repository. In my case, that's demo. So if I move into that and then list the directory contents here, you should see all the files and directories you typically see in a Laravel application. And of course, it should mirror what you're seeing when you look at your code base on GitHub. So now that I've got my code base, I'm going to go ahead and open this in my file explorer just to make it easier to look at the project and work with my files. So in VS Code, I'm going to say open folder. And I'm going to open up that var www demo directory. And seeing this here, let me zoom in on the contents of our project. The first thing we should observe is we don't have a vendor directory. The vendor directory holds all of our outside dependencies in our Laravel application. And the vendor directory is managed by Composer. It's not something that we are typically tracking as part of our code repositories. In fact, if you look at your git ignore file, you can see that the vendor directory is typically listed there. This makes sense because it's outside code. We don't need to track the development of that code. We simply just need to have it. And like I said, Composer is what is going to get that code for us, not cloning our project to the server. So knowing that, let's get Composer to bring in our vendor directory. I'm going to bring back my terminal window, making sure that I'm within the project directory. I'm going to invoke Composer. And there's two possible commands I might run here to get my vendor directory. Let me go back to the notes to reference this. Command number one would be if you're working on a production server. In other words, you're working on the server where your real world users are interacting with the application. There you would want to run Composer install optimize autoloader no dev. This is going to do a few different things. One is going to exclude any of your outside dependencies that are just for development purposes. Things like testing tools. We don't need them on production, so we would exclude them there. It's also going to optimize your autoloader just to make class locations within your application faster. So that's going to be good. And then Composer install, that's going to make it so that when it's getting your outside dependencies, it's looking at the version numbers of your dependencies as written to your composer.lock file. And the lock file is something that is written when you're working on your application in development. It's going to record the specific version numbers of the outside dependencies you're working with. And so by running Composer install on the production server, it's going to get the version numbers from composer.lock, ensuring that all of the dependencies you're using in production exactly match the dependencies you were using in development, so everything's consistent. Now contrast that with Composer update. This command you might run if you're working on a development server, because Composer update, rather than reading from your lock file, it's going to read from your just regular composer.json file where you list all of your dependencies. And it's going to pull in the latest version of those dependencies within the version constraints that you set. And after it does that, it writes the specific versions that it got to the lock file so that when you are operating on production and you're running Composer install, again, it's going to grab the exact versions that were set up in development so that everything remains consistent. So that's a bit of a tangent about Composer in general. Long story short, if this is a production server you're setting up, go with this command. If you're working on a development server, go with this command. For this example, I'm going to treat what I'm working on as a production server, so I am going to use the Composer install command. So let me run this, and again, just make sure you're in your application when you run these Composer commands. I'm going to say yes again, just ignoring that warning. You can see Composer pulling in all of my outside dependencies. And with that complete, I now have my vendor directory. Another important piece of content within our application that is currently missing because it's ignored by Git is our environment file. The environment file contains configurations that are specific to the different environments or contexts in which you run your application. And so it's not something you keep synchronized with your entire code base. Therefore, you have to manually create it whenever you're setting up your application in a new context. And the way I'm going to create it is every Laravel application has a .env.example file. We can use this as like a starting template for our environment file. So I'm just going to create a duplicate copy of that. I'll just do it via command line. So we're going to say copy env.example to .env. All right, then opening this up, there's a bunch of different configs in here, but the most important ones we need to address are just this top chunk here, all of our app configs. We can go ahead and change our app name. In my case, I'm just going to call it demo. We can set our environment. Common environments you might see are local, production, staging, testing. In this case, I am treating this as a production server, so I'm going to call this the production environment. I'll come back to app key in a second. We're going to need that. For app debug, typically on a production environment, we would set debugging to false. This is going to make it so if there are errors on our application, the user is going to see a generic error page rather than like full details about the error. Because I am setting this application up for the first time though, I am going to leave this to true just in case when I run this application initially, if there's any problems, I could see full debugging information. Once things are running smoothly though, I would want to come back and change this to false on a production context. But this is not technically real world yet. I don't have real world users using it, so I'm okay with debugging information being output. For the app URL, to set up whatever domain or subdomain you're using. So again, in my case, that was democodewithsusan.com. All right, and you could skim through the other settings here. You can leave most of them as the default unless there's something you've specifically worked with on this application. For example, if you've set up Redis, you would want to go in and put the appropriate configs there. If you have a mail server you want to work with, you would want to put the configs there. But for this bare bones example, this is all I need to change to get this up and running. Now let's address the app key. I'm not going to manually enter it. Instead, I'm going to invoke Artisan, Laravel's built-in command line utility, and have it generate it for me. So that's going to be PHP Artisan key generate. All right, you could see it filled it in with an encrypted value. This is going to be used for security and encryption within my Laravel application. That should be all I need to do in the environment file for right now. So let's check back in on the notes and see our next step, which is to set some permissions, specifically our storage and our Bootstrap cache directory. These need to be writable by our web server because when we're running our application, it's going to write contents to those directories, things like cache info, session data, logging, etc. To set the permissions on this, we need to figure out which user on our system our web server is running as. And I've got a command that's going to do that for us. It's basically going to look at our running processes, search for Apache, and tell us what the user is. So we can run this as written in the notes. And you can see in this server, the username it returns is www-data, which is a common username that is often set up on servers like this. All right, so now that we know that, we're going to run two change ownership commands, and we're going to change the owner to be, in my case, www-data. You would want to swap this out with whatever you got from the previous step, and then the name of the directory you want to change the ownership of. So we're going to do this first for storage and then Bootstrap cache next. And with our permissions all set, that brings us to our final step, which is configuring the site on the server. In other words, we need to make it so that when we go to our domain or subdomain, it's actually going to point to this application. The way we're going to do that is creating a site config in our etc Apache 2 sites available directory. So in my code editor, I can create a new file using the code command. I'm going to specify that directory, and then you can call the config file whatever you want. In my case, I'm going to name it after the application. So I'm going to say demo.config or conf for short. Common convention you'll see with these config files. All right, so that creates a new empty file waiting for my config. I'm just hovering over it, checking that the path is as expected. And the configs I'm going to put in here, I'm going to borrow from this template in the notes. We've got a virtual host config. I'm going to paste that in. And we just want to go through and make changes as appropriate here. So starting with the server name, what is the domain or subdomain you want to load the site? And the way I'm setting this up, it's democodewithsusan.com. So I'm going to set that. The document root should point to the directory of your application, specifically the public subdirectory. Right, so that's this directory here. Whenever you're running a Laravel application, you're configuring your web server, it always needs to point to that public subdirectory. That's the only directory that should be accessible by the web browser. When we go to the server, it's going to point to that directory. It should load this index file, and that index file is set up to bootstrap your entire application. And it will communicate with the rest of the code here, but the web browser itself should always just point to that public subdirectory. All right, so set that as needed for your document root. use the same path for this directory options here. Here's where we're setting some necessary options for that document root. And you can leave it as the defaults I have here in this template. And then the final thing down here is just some file names for things like your error logs and your access logs. So you can change this to whatever the name of your application is. In my case, I'll just leave it as demo. All right, so with that config in place and saved, I just need to enable it. And I'm going to do that with this command too, A2 enable site, and then the name of the config file. So I can copy this exactly as written. Of course, on your case, you would want to update demo.config with whatever file name you used. And then after it's enabled, I like to run this command, Apache to control-t. This is just going to check and make sure that there's no errors in your configs. So I'll just run that. You will see this message about determining the server's fully qualified domain name. That's fine. You can ignore that. Any other messages you see here beyond what I'm showing here would indicate that there's some problems in your config. So just read through that, address any problems that are reports. But assuming everything is okay, we're going to do one final restart on Apache with our system control restart Apache 2 command. And we should be ready to test this out. So we should be able to go to demo.codewithsusan.com. It should point to our demo directory, specifically that public subdirectory, and load up our application. Let's see if that's the case. And perfect. There's that same homepage we were seeing when we were running this application on our local server. We're not seeing any sort of errors. We can also test that our routing system is working correctly. So if I go to my test route I had set up, we can see that that's reporting as expected. So everything looks good on my end, but if you reach this point and it's not working as expected, your application's not loading or you're getting an error page or anything like that, check out at the bottom of the notes that accompany this video. I have a link to another guide on common Laravel installation issues that can walk you through troubleshooting why things might not be working as expected. You can also leave a comment below describing your particular problem and I can try to point you in the right direction.